Warning, this video is a critique and will touch on aspects without regards to spoilers. I recommend you play this game before watching. You know, randomized content is going through somewhat of a golden age at the moment. On the single player side, you have roguelikes flourishing with some healthy genre mixing going on, while on the other hand, you have the large multiplayer sandboxes, mainly dominated by the survival genre. After a decade that seemed to focus on strongly linear design, it seems players are much more open to procedurally generated content. So with this in mind, today we'll be looking at Hand of Fate, an indie action title with a card game twist. Like many other recent indie hits, our story begins on Kickstarter, where Defiant Development managed to get around $54,000 for this game, which was promised in early 2014. What actually happened is that the game entered Steam Early Access around mid-2014 and eventually came out in February of 2015, but such stories are common. It seems that delayed Kickstarter projects are the rule rather than the exception. But what is Hand of Fate about? Well, it is a sword and sorcery style affair where you sit at a table with a mysterious character called the Dealer and play a game where you must explore levels whose encounters are represented by cards. The actual meat of the game is divided into choose your own adventure style segments and combat sections that take heavily from modern action games. Certainly an interesting combination that works well in theory, but how well does it hold up in practice? Hand of Fate actually has quite a high level of graphical fidelity, at least in relation to other indie games. The main screen with the Dealer has animations galore with him fidgeting and being quite expressive even though he wears a cowl. There is even a little spider that creeps around the table which looks quite well done, even though, like in all things, there are imperfections. I have no idea who thought this excessively twitchy candle flame looked even vaguely okay. But beyond that, the retro black and white card stylizations are excellent. I genuinely enjoyed this look, which is inspired by old fairy tale books. So yes, looking at the Dealer handle the cards and emote is quite engaging, but the combat visuals are somewhat subpar in comparison. Most successful lower budget games try to go for a highly stylized aesthetic since they don't have the necessary funds to match the AAA industry. But Hand of Fate actually does an honorable job. The negative aspect is the animation quality. Your character's attacks are well done and impactful, but that cannot be said of the enemies that most of the time look like they are tapping or just scratching you. Something which the larger enemies thankfully avoid by virtue of size. The issue is further compounded by the counter-based combat, which I'll talk about later, but the rather deliberate way in which enemies attack combined with your sped up counter animations makes the whole thing look rather silly. The leaping ratman fights get into humorous territory with all the dashing around. The death animations are also rather amusing. Enemies just ragdollize in a very rigid manner. What is perplexing is that whenever the last creature in an encounter is killed, the camera zooms in and you can see all the clipping and non-existent facial animation in all its glory. I don't understand why they did this. It might have been meant to boost production values, but instead it just emphasizes the janky graphical parts. The last thing I want to mention is a somewhat insane nitpick, but it annoyed me so much. I don't know if it is related to resolutions or some such, but there is a minuscule graphical corruption on the bottom right of the main screen. I first thought it was a dead pixel, but it only happens in that part of the game. It is so minor, but I couldn't help but notice it during transitions when the screen was black. With all that being said though, Hand of Fate has solid visual presentation and I am overall impressed. The sound design isn't spectacular, but it is functional. Some combat sounds aren't as impactful as they should be, like the sword hits and the shield bashes, but others like the hammer hits and combat ending sounds are well done. Not much to talk about here, could have been better, could have been worse. The soundtrack by Jeff Van Dyke falls pretty much under the same category. You have probably heard this fantasy style music tens of times before if you usually play such games. I find the heavy percussion elements well suited for the combat tracks, but you probably won't remember any of this in a week. One weird thing to mention though is the ending track, which is this deep sounding song with melodramatic lyrics that don't really fit with a mostly systemically focused game. It is quite jarring. Overall, the sound is nothing special, but there are also no major failures associated with it. So let us get to the nitty-gritty parts regarding the systems and content. The game's focus is exploring encounters in which conflicts are resolved either by combat or by playing a shells game with cards, where there are various degrees of failure or success. Many of the cards feature choose-your-own-adventure elements that lead to different outcomes. What is interesting here is the token reward mechanic. Each card has a token that is given if the encounter is completed, sometimes under specific circumstances, and these tokens unlock items and new cards that continue the storyline of the respective series of encounters. Like for example, helping a pair of lovers escape and then confronting the daughter's father while he is looking for them. It provides an interesting method of parsing out content and keeping the player's interest in unlocking the rest. And keeping the player interested is important because there are two modes of play that are somewhat intertwined. First, you have the story mode where you have to defeat 12 bosses represented by 4 suites. Each suite represents an enemy type, which can be bandits, skeletons, ratmen and lizardmen, with each having a jack, a queen and a king as the respective bosses. After their defeat, you can challenge the dealer and end the story. It is important to note that in this mode, both your encounter and equipment decks can be customized, which is an interesting twist because you can theoretically fill your deck with easy encounters, but you don't unlock the more powerful items and the rest of the content this way. Also, keep in mind that your encounter deck is shuffled with the dealers at the start of a session, and his cards are usually the most dangerous ones. Each boss adding different encounter cards to your deck as well as permanent negative modifiers for that session. After finishing the story mode, I must say that I found it to be genuinely engaging. It does start a little slow with introducing the gameplay elements, but for an 8 to 12 hours experience, it does an excellent job. There are always new cards being discovered each session, and there are plenty of encounters to make you feel like you're uncovering a world, or at least a minor story arc. When the player finishes story mode, he can continue in endless mode that, like the name says, goes on forever and uses every single card and item you have unlocked. But there are several problems that severely hamper the enjoyment here in comparison to the aforementioned story mode. First off is the fact that there is no moment of structure to the tension. The game goes on forever with new encounters that contain bosses from story mode and with penalties given after the completion of every level. It would have been more interesting if you would face the bosses and then have some sort of reset, like losing half of everything you own. But moving on, there will be harder enemies and even boss encounters that feature the whole suites, eventually reaching a point where the final encounter would consist of every jack, queen and king put together. As it stands now, it feels like a grind rather than a struggle. The second major flaw that personally killed this mode for me after some time is the ridiculously harsh encounter failures that appear later in the session. Usually around level 20, failure in the Shells card game results in session-ending negative effects like losing all your gold, blessings, or sometimes even half your maximum hit points. I once went from over 100 hit points to under 10 hit points in the span of 3 encounters. That is just ridiculous. And on top of this are some curses like the one which damages you for every ring you have. This can end your game since you easily accrue many rings later in a session. The fundamental problem here is escalation. Story mode has sessions with different rules that have a beginning and end, while endless mode just drags on and on. Essentially, once you reach the 20th level, it is just a game of chance to see how long it takes for you to get a session-ending card. Since Hand of Fate has both player skill and luck in large quantities, the focus should have been put on player skill, since ending a session just because of an unlucky card just isn't satisfying, while dying in combat provides you a sense of struggle. I think effects that read more like during the next combat you take 200% plus damage would have been much more interesting since it leaves room for player ability. There is also a third type of encounter I should mention, which is only found rarely since only a few cards feature it. It is pretty straightforward. You need to use timing and reactions to reach the end of a gauntlet filled with traps. It is simple but satisfying. I just wish there was more of it since it provides a good bit of variety. I really don't know why they didn't add more. The assets are there already, and they even made a few unique ones that only appear in a session against the dealer boss. It just seems like a missed opportunity, and while I do like the way the content is structured, I can't help but feel that developer inexperience led to too many other missed opportunities in this area. It is here though that I would like to praise the Wild Cards expansion, which actually does a lot to improve the game, especially endless mode. It essentially allows you to play different characters with different bonuses and weaknesses that force different playstyles, like eating only equipment instead of food or being forced to defend merchants. In the end, even though there are flaws, story mode does provide a great experience that has well-made pacing, and even endless mode can offer a few more hours of engaging with systems that sadly aren't all that deep. So with that being said, let us move on to This will probably be a deal breaker for many people. It is basically budget Arkham Asylum. If you have played any modern action game, you have played this. You mash your attack while pressing the counter button when the prompt appears above the enemy's head. Some enemies have unblockable attacks, while others have range attacks that can be reflected via countering. That's all there is to it. If I ever make a video on modern Batman games, I will probably repeat myself, but this combat system is style over substance incarnate. Good melee action systems revolve around the concept of timing your attacks in relation to your defense. It is the very concept of risk-reward gameplay. This instant counter mechanic where you aren't really punished for just continuously pressing the counter button and you are essentially invulnerable during the animation is just brain dead. But the funny thing is that Batman also had a stealth system that combined somewhat with the combat to form a coherent experience. Sadly, the other games who just straight up copied this combat style did not have any complementary or auxiliary systems to balance all of this, resulting in some absolutely asinine examples of combat.
And spam spacebar here. Did you know that I'm actually invulnerable? I'm not even playing the fucking game, and I'm unkillable. All these enemies can't kill me. But this is, trust me, there's a lot of skill going into this, okay?
So where does Hand of Fate fit into all of this? Well, the fact that arenas end very quickly I would say lessens the inherent issues with the system, and it is quite functional at the end of the day, if underwhelming. The main problem here is the same as with encounters. The combat scales terribly towards higher levels. The arenas are quite small and they don't get any bigger, resulting in them getting jam-packed with enemies. The issue is that unblockable attacks can hit while you're in the process of countering, thus jumping around to avoid any attacks is the only way to make sure you never get hit. But this turns the combat from boring to frustratingly tedious since you are just doing hit and run attacks that results in a lot more time spent just jumping around. Beyond that, the way finishers are implemented is to the detriment of the game. After a set amount of hits, enemies fall down, and if their life is low enough, they don't roll away when you try to instantly kill them. The problem is that the second you begin hitting downed opponents, someone will make a beeline for you and try to hit you. I understand the intention, but this gets so repetitive in the process that it feels like the circus. You get one guy down, then counter the guy trying to stop you, knocking him down, and then repeat with the next one. This is not good gameplay, I'm sorry to say. If they had to implement such artificial behavior to balance things out, they should have just removed the concept of finishing off opponents, instead of forcing you to play what essentially equates to whack-a-mole. This issue does disappear when there are many opponents with unblockable attacks, but that just turns into the frustrating hit and runs I mentioned before. All in all, the combat is definitely the weakest component here, and it is clear Defiant Development just took a popular system and implemented best they could. It isn't the worst example of this style, and at least I died from time to time due to timing.
It's not just cinematic, this isn't just quick time events, okay?
I just hope that if this product gets a reiteration in some form, combat is the first place to receive improvements, hopefully in the form of an overhaul to a completely different style. While the game is strongly focused on its systems, it actually does have elements of a story and excellent atmosphere. In fact, I would say the dealer is one of the game's highlights. His voice actor does a good job of instilling this character with personality. He can be menacing and brooding, but also humorous and teasing at times.
Soon the game will end. I will take your piece from the board. It will be done. Unlike other opponents, I will remember you fondly. This thing I have created, I can hardly bear the sight of it now. I've worked my way through its many convolutions so many times, run through these conversations in my mind over and over again, wondered how it all ends. Will I ever know the truth?
It is also impressive how much dialogue they recorded. Each card has its own little introduction plus numerous amounts of comments at diverse situations such as running out of food. The dealer makes the game come to life, both figuratively and literally. In the story, he uses his magic to make the situations on the cards real, and his musings combined with his personality make the context intriguing. Most players will probably find the experience dry without the spoken flavor text, though it will probably get repetitive after some tens of hours, but by then the experience itself is complete. There is one issue here though which is somewhat bizarre, mainly that there are 4 entities in this game. There is the player, the player's character, the dealer and the designer. Essentially, there are moments when the 4th wall is broken in a very straightforward manner and not for humorous purposes. The dealer directly asks you if you are just wasting your time with the game as if the designers themselves were asking you this. But at other times, there are moments of philosophical musings and mulling over death and the end of the game.
Once, many came to play the game. Now, it's so few. The bored, the obsessed, the weak. Some come here merely to fill their mind with anything else but their problems, with any other issue than the thing on their mind today. Is that what you're doing now?
At the same time, your character has his own narrative. The whole thing takes place in some sort of netherworld that is hinted to be the afterlife, the cards themselves being made out of his lost memories.
Each of these cards is crafted from your memories and built from your experience. I created them, but only in the abstract. It is the importance you place on them that makes them real.
But it is never revealed why your character is here, and more importantly, what is he hoping to achieve by playing. The story ends with the dealer being defeated and with the warrior taking his steed and continuing the game. It is pretty cut and dry. There are moments where apparent characters from the forgotten past appear, but it doesn't lead into anything. The story itself doesn't feel just underdeveloped. It feels incomplete. But taking everything into account, I would say that the game does have a strong context by way of its atmosphere, even though its narrative can create subpar moments. Even though I had plenty of negative things to say about Hand of Fate, it would be disingenuous of me if I didn't admit how much fun I had. While the flaws are there and some are bigger than others, the core is rock solid. Defiant Development sacrificed the combat aspect by going down a very bland and safe route to focus on a dungeon crawling experience mixed with a car game. And it genuinely works. I wouldn't be surprised if someone down the line gets inspired by this and makes a more polished version with better combat. But even so, Hand of Fate can stand on its own 2 feet proudly as a polished and engaging experience for anywhere between 10 to 20 hours, which is more than many games can claim. I am quite curious to see if Defiant Development's next game will try to go even further with mixing concepts and maybe adding their own originality to the mix. Time will tell if Hand of Fate was a fluke or a sign of greater things to come.